thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Amanda Clevinger, and I'm the Policy and Programs Director at Bright Power. We're excited to be talking about Local Law 97 today. We'll kick off the webinar in just a second. If you have questions as we go, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat box feature. We'll have plenty of time at the end to address your questions as we go. We are going to be removing any AI note takers, so please turn that feature off. There will most likely be a recording of this presentation made available to you all after the fact, so you don't need your AI note taker. All right, so let's get started. We are in a really interesting moment for Local Law 97. And now that we've wrapped up our first year of reporting, there were a lot of good lessons learned from that process that we want to share with you all. And so today's session will be a little bit of 97 overview, but mostly talking about key tips and strategies to make both your short-term emissions reporting and your long-term compliance easier, to make it more cost-effective and to hopefully leave you with fewer headaches. So it's going to be a really relevant and valuable discussion this morning. All right, so today you'll be hearing from myself and our Vice President of Building Decarbonization, Punit Shah. Punit is our resident technical expert at Bright Power, leading both our audit and our retrofit consulting teams, working with existing buildings across a bunch of different sectors, including affordable housing, market rate multifamily, and commercial properties, to help identify and implement energy efficiency and electrification projects. So welcome, Punit. And like I said previously, my name is Amanda. I lead our policy and programs team. Our team consults on funding opportunities for our projects like incentive programs, financing, tax credits, and we are also working to help our clients understand new regulatory and compliance requirements like New York City's Local Law 97. We are a full-time team of 3, working to track all of the latest updates and developments on the law so that as the guidance evolves rapidly, we can always give you the latest and greatest intel, which is a really unique feature amongst the market of 97 service providers. So a little bit about Bright Power for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So Bright Power is working with building owners and managers, along with lenders, to provide a really holistic approach to reducing energy and emissions at their properties. Our proprietary database includes over 100,000 buildings. We've performed over 2,800 energy audits. We've completed over 600 energy efficiency retrofits. So we're doing a lot of work in this space. We're really excited about it. So a little bit more about our approach. So in everything that we do, we're always thinking about find, fix, follow. That's our universal approach. We use our proprietary benchmarking platform called Energy Scorecards to find opportunities within portfolios that are prime for further interventions like energy audits. And then we use our retrofit consulting and our design services to fix the problems that we identify. And finally, we follow up to make sure that our projects were actually successful. And that's our follow phase. Okay, so here's our agenda for today. So we will do a very brief 97 refresh. I know a lot of you are probably sick of hearing us say, what is Local Law 97? But bear with us, we'll do a very quick refresh for those of you who are newer to this. And then we're going to spend the meat of our discussion today talking about what happened in 2025, going through some really critical lessons learned from emissions reporting, how to set yourself up for better emissions reporting going forward, since that data is the foundation of all of your future 97 compliance planning. And then the second one here to note that we'll be spending a lot of time on is number 4, getting 2030 ready. Our expert Punit is going to talk in detail about how to approach this process to plan and implement retrofit work that you're going to need when the emissions limits drop in 2030. All right, so let's dive in. So a very quick refresh on how the law works. So Local Law 97 was passed by the City Council back in 2019 as part of the Climate Mobilization Act. The majority of emissions in our city come from buildings, and so city officials set some pretty aggressive goals to reduce our emissions from buildings over time. So you can see here that the Climate Mobilization Act is trying to cut building emissions 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So some pretty ambitious goals. And so the law, Local Law 97, was specifically designed to address these goals. How do we meet them? And so 97 sets individual performance targets for buildings that get more stringent over time, now until 2050. And we have a brief video to show you a little bit more about how Local Law 97 works. Let's get this way.
Understanding Local Law 97 with Bright Power. Every building uses energy to operate. In New York City, approximately 70% of carbon emissions come from buildings. Under Local Law 97, energy use is measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Each building is assigned a carbon cap that becomes more stringent over time. Local Law 97 fines are $268 per metric ton of CO2 over the cap per year. In other words, if nothing changes, buildings will face rising annual penalties. By 2030, some properties are projected to face average annual fines of $1.8 million. Since major upgrades can take years to complete, the time to act is now.
All right. That's great. Less talking from me. Let's keep going. Okay. So there are 5 pathways under the law. The first 3 that you see here are the same thing. They just have different start dates. So all of those first 3 pathways, these require annual emissions reporting. You demonstrate every year that your building is performing below its assigned limit for that year, and if you are emitting above that limit, you get fined. And so every year you have to report that. The only difference is when the reporting for those first 3 pathways starts. So standard pathway, that's CP0, your reporting started last year. The first baseline year was calendar year 2024, which was reported in 2025. For the 2026 pathway, CP1, the first baseline year is right now, calendar year 2026, which will get reported for the first time starting next year in the spring of 2027. And for 2035 pathway, the baseline year is calendar year 2035, reported in 2036. So the top 3 are collectively referred to under the law as Article 320. A prescriptive pathway, that's CP3 on the CBL, also known as Article 321. You have 2 choices. You can either install 13 PECMs or prescriptive energy conservation measures, or you can show that your building is already beating its 2030 emissions limit now. And prescriptive pathway is generally a one and done requirement, not annual like the other pathways, but you have to maintain your affordability eligibility over time. And last but not least, if you have a building that's owned by the city, you are not subject to normal 97 requirements. There's a different flavor of requirements for you. NYCHA buildings do have requirements that are very similar to the normal 97 ones, but it's overseen by NYCHA, not by the DOB. So as we talked about on a lot of these webinars, pathways are not a choose your own adventure situation. There's a list of specific documents to prove eligibility for each pathway called the CBO matrix. If you have the right documents that are listed in that CBO matrix, you can do that pathway, but otherwise you can't move around on a whim. So for today's conversation, we're going to focus specifically on the first 3, these Article 320, right? Standard pathway, 2026 pathway, and 2035 pathway. We are not going to talk about prescriptive pathway today. If you have questions about prescriptive pathway with Bright Power, you can reach out to your Bright Power account manager or project manager. And we also have a QR code at the end of the webinar that you can scan if you're not working with Bright Power, but you have prescriptive pathway questions. All right, let's keep moving. So this is really interesting. Let's take a look at the progress across the city. Here you can see a breakdown of bins, which are essentially buildings across the city that are subject to the law. Now, when you look at standard and 2026 pathway, there's close to 50,000 bins that are combined on those 2 pathways. That's a huge number. And the DOB is reporting that in 2025, like roughly 90% of the bins on standard pathway did at minimum engage a service provider to start moving towards 97 compliance. And this is notable for a couple of reasons. Number one being that the real estate market is really taking 97 seriously. There's definitely a small contingent of people who were saying for a while that the law is never going to amount to anything, the city will never implement this, people will just ignore it. But these numbers clearly show that that's not true. The majority of the real estate market is taking this law seriously. And if you stick your head in the sand, you're just putting your portfolios at risk of really serious fines. The second piece to think about here is that this is an enormous volume of properties that are all swimming in the same direction at once. Puneet will talk more about this later. It's not 100% of properties that will need to retrofit before 2030, but it's definitely the majority. So that's still a huge volume of owners and managers that are all looking for help and looking for funding at the same time. And it's in your interest to try to get to the front of the line. And so that's what we're going to try to help everyone think about today is how to approach both emissions reporting and your retrofit projects in a really strategic way to increase your chances of successful compliance and also to avoid unnecessary cost and administrative burden to help make sure that you don't get inadvertently stuck at the back of the line. Okay, so let's start with emissions reporting and the lessons that we learned during our first year in 2025, because emissions reporting is the foundation of your local law 97 journey. You will not be able to avoid big fines in the future if your emissions reporting data is garbage. So that's important. Let's break down what we mean by that. So, a quick refresh on what emissions reporting is. So, emissions reporting refers to the annual requirement to have a registered design professional like Bright Power stamp and certify your emissions for the previous year and submit it to the DOB in the BEAM portal. The report consists of several pieces, so it includes your energy consumption for the year, how many bins and BBLs you have, if you're taking any special deductions, like if you have solar or cogen on site. It also includes your gross floor area or your GFA broken down by space type. So there's a lot of different pieces that go into the 97 reporting. So getting it more into like the lessons learned here. So technically, local law 84 benchmarking, right? That's the benchmarking that's due to the city every year. And local law 97 emissions reporting are separate requirements. But in actuality, they are connected. And that's because the energy consumption data for 97 comes from your 84 benchmarking. And there's more pieces like that that are similarly interconnected. And so there's a lot of folks out there in year one of the 97 reporting that were like, oh, maybe I can save a couple bucks by having a cheap service provider do my benchmarking and have someone else be my 97 RDP and file my 97 emissions report. And what we're learning is that that's a bad idea for a couple of reasons that we're going to talk through. Because when you think you're saving a little bit of money, you're actually setting yourself up for both short term and long term risk under 97 by doing that. So let's look at an example. Okay, so this is a real life portfolio that signed with Bright Power to do local law 97 emissions reporting, but they kept their old third party benchmarking provider that was really low quality, and I'll tell you why. As Bright Power's emissions reporting team was coordinating with this third party benchmarking company, excuse me, we discovered some really serious issues with the data that they were sending to us to include in the 97 reporting, right? And you can see here some of those issues. The meters were set up incorrectly, recording some negative usage. They were missing data. The other provider had missed 84 deadlines completely. There were also unexplained data spikes and usage differences. So you can see that the other benchmarking provider was really struggling here. And there were some obvious issues with their data collection process. And that means that it now takes more time and more money for Bright Power to figure all of this out. And it's also a bigger headache for this client who's trying to make sense of all of this. And so it ends up just being a waste of everyone's time and money trying to figure this out. Let's look at another scenario that comes up a lot when people are using third party benchmarking providers. Okay, so this one is related to the GFA, that's the gross floor area. So this is for a mixed use market rate multifamily property that we're having some issues with the GFA. So you can see here at the top that there were some different GFA values reported between the other provider and what was reported on the 97 front. And there's a discrepancy between the size numbers and space types that were reported. Now, having a size discrepancy is not the end of the world at this point because the city realizes that a lot of folks for a long time were underreporting their size to avoid property taxes. And so the city acknowledges that there will likely be some gaps between the way it was reported in the past and the way it is now. So that's okay for the moment. But even though the city may not immediately penalize you for a size discrepancy, this is still a really critical problem because of the downstream effects that this causes. Inconsistent GFA oftentimes can mean issues with the space types and the sizes of those space types, and that has a significant effect on your 97 emissions and fines. And the 97 fine can change drastically based on which space types you have and how big they are. And so, where do we get the information about those space types? It's coming from your GFA report. And that's why this scenario gets a little bit hairy because when you have a third party provider breaking down the square footage one way and the 97 provider has different information from the client, it means that there are risks, to the owner and the manager. It means that we have to take more time and money to coordinate with the other provider to make sure that what we have is right and what they have was wrong. We have to rerun the calculations for the emissions. We have to debrief with the client again to make sure that we have the right information and also to make sure that the client was not affected by any changes to their emissions and fine projections now that the data that it's based on has changed from what they may have been looking at projections that were coming from old data in the past. And so again here, like the first example, it creates a bunch of headaches. It creates a process that is more time intensive and more burdensome for everyone. And so this is why it's important to think differently about your benchmarking data and strongly consider a provider like Bright Power who can do both your 87 and your 97, or excuse me, your 84, not 87, your 84 benchmarking and your 97 with a really high quality approach because there are a lot of those bottom of the barrel benchmarking providers that are out there. And when the data that they're sharing with our team is crap, we're going to do our best to resolve it, but it's much more effective to have a service provider that you trust to do both pieces. Someone who can walk you through a coordinated approach for both laws, making sure that your energy consumption is consistent and makes sense, that your GFA and your space types are reported and allocated accurately, that your meters are captured correctly, that if you have a campus, that it's set up the right way, because that stuff is kind of complicated. There's a lot of steps that go into doing emissions reporting well. And think about how infuriating it would be to find out that maybe some properties that you thought were facing 97 fines might not actually be just because some meters were wrong or your GFA and your space types were off. So there's a direct and immediate impact on your potential fines. And we don't want you spending money on fines that could be inaccurate. But more importantly, having bad emissions reporting data also affects your long-term 97 planning because the fines will get more stringent for everyone now through 2050. And most properties will need to undertake significant efficiency or electrification work in order to do that. And here's what could happen. If the quality of your emissions reporting data is poor, you could spend money on a retrofit sometime in the future and it may not perform as projected because your baseline data is inaccurate, which means even though you spent all this money on this retrofit project, you might still get 97 fines if the retrofit underperforms, which is a huge risk. And all of that is simply because you weren't investing in the quality of your 84 benchmarking and your 97 emissions reporting data from the outset. Something to think about for sure. But let's keep moving. We have a lot more to cover. Okay, so let's transition now into 2030 compliance specifically and thinking about strategies to consider for this. Okay, so I referenced a little bit already that the fines are going to go up over time. Most properties will not face fines until 2030, and that's when the hard part starts. So REVME estimates that the market could collectively face just under $900 million in annual fines starting in 2030 if you don't do any retrofit work to get ready. And that will increase every 5 years. So it's only going to get worse. In 2035, 2040, 2045, right? Every 5 years, the fines are going to get worse. So this is a really serious situation, not only for 2030, but also thinking about the trajectory to 2050 as well. Okay. So here we have a really great breakdown of what type of work multifamily properties specifically will need for 2030. So this is based on some data from the Urban Green Council. And here on the right, you can see that roughly 35% of multifamily properties are already compliant with the 2030 limits now. That's great, but it's a small portion. Most of the properties, the rest of the properties in this pie are currently exceeding their 2030 limits. So at the bottom here, you can see that roughly 25% should be able to comply with energy efficiency measures by themselves without any electrification work. Another 25% will likely need a combination of some efficiency and some electrification work, but maybe not a full electrification project. So maybe a partial or a hybrid approach would work here. And then there's 15% here that are going to need significant work on both fronts, significant energy efficiency investments, and also potentially pursuing full electrification for 2030. So 65% of the buildings, multifamily buildings that is, will need to do some type of retrofit in order to get ready for 2030. So that's a lot. So in a moment, Puneet's going to talk about the retrofit strategies to reduce the larger fines that the majority of buildings under 97 will eventually face. But first, let's talk briefly about the properties that are only facing small fines in 2030. So thinking about properties with smaller fines is generally best done as a two-step process as is outlined here. So the first phase is step one, looking at your data, right? Checking your GFA, right? If your GFA documents are old, you can consider getting a measurement to get a more accurate GFA. You can also check for data or other metering errors. And then also, this third one is an interesting one, particularly for mixed use properties, right? Checking the breakdown of the emissions between the owner and the tenant controlled spaces. Because if you have some commercial tenants, there may be some things that you can do to help bring awareness to those tenants that their emissions are out of control and they need to do something about it. And you may be able to avoid taking other steps at the property. And then for step two, if these step one ideas and options are not enough to bring you below your limit, you can look here at step two. These are what we call regulatory strategies that you can also consider to pair with step one. These include options like purchasing offset credits, pursuing beneficial electrification credits, looking at ways to potentially purchase off-site solar and energy storage. You can also look at purchasing RECs, renewable energy credits, and there are other adjustments, extensions, and good faith efforts that we can also explore as well. This list is not exhaustive. There are dozens of different regulatory strategies under the law to consider that will vary based on your pathway, based on your 2024 fines, your 2030 fines, etc. So not all of these options listed here in step two are 100% confirmed yet by the DOB to be available in 2030 and beyond. But the point is that there are a lot of different options to consider, and you want to make sure that you're working with an RDP that not only understands what the options are, but can also talk you through the pros and cons of each of these in terms of the cost, the administrative burden. There's a lot of different things to be thinking about here. And so we're happy to sit down with folks one-on-one to talk more about this specifically if they have questions. But in the longer term, as the fines get bigger, the majority of properties are going to need to implement retrofit work, and that's what Puneet is going to talk about next.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. A couple of things that I wanted to say. You'll hear some repeated thoughts from my end on what Amanda has already covered. It's all intentional because we want to just emphasize some of the critical nature of the work that is required. And two things that you will see as a continual theme of what we're covering today is the urgency of the work that is needed and the complexity. So just wanted to start with those key points and get into the next slide. Cool. Okay. So for us, the way we are thinking, Local Law 97 submission being successful is the first strategy to achieving your carbon emission goals for 2030. The successful submission, as kind of Amanda covered, should essentially be broken out into three parts. The GFA measurement, it becomes extremely critical because it will establish your baseline and your energy cap. If you have not had your property measured, now is the time to get it because, again, that will give you a very clear idea of what your carbon emission caps are. If you have any space usages that are kind of different than your standard space usage or the most common one, that would also give you an understanding of the carbon emissions you're working with. Evaluating the utility data just beyond collecting it from your benchmarking perspective, but evaluating trends, the utility accounts associated with different space usages, areas where your carbon emissions are exceeding their cap becomes a very critical component of, again, coming up with a strategy for 2030. And then finally, as part of the submission, doing a thorough beam review, the RDP reviewing all the information, making sure it is in line with what is expected for the property's energy usage and carbon emissions becomes critical as the first step in success. Next slide. Right. Two key components that are part of the complex submissions for the first cycle, but will have an impact on what you do 2030 and beyond. First is renewable energy systems. So if you have any energy systems that are associated with solar, combined heat and power, electric vehicle charging, so either your system, property is generating electricity or using it for any of these components, you have accommodations in the current kind of rule to evaluate that and have a positive impact on your emissions. But those are going to be changing in the next cycle. So it's critical to understand the benefits that you have right now that you want to plan for in the future. Same thing goes with campus submissions for properties that have more than one buildings or multiple building sharing systems. The first cycle is going to give you an opportunity to combine all the energy consumption and in one submission, but that's going to change in 2030 cycle. So any adjustments that you're currently doing will have to change and you'll have to consider them for a successful 2030 submission. Next slide. So we wanted to present the phases in a timeline perspective. So if your property is currently facing any amount of 2030 fines, you should ideally be in the investigation and planning phase. I'll go through in each and every phase in further detail, but this represents where you would ideally want to be in a particular year. Right. So from now, you would want to have an investigation, identify measures, come up with a plan to implement, and ideally phase out your implementation in a way that you're done with implementing all the measures you would want to implement to get the property under 2030 fines by 2029. Why is that important? Because 2030 is your baseline year. So any energy consumption that happens in 2030 is going to be evaluating your 2031 fines. Remember, the cap changes in 2030. So 2031 through the next 5 years is when your new cap starts. So all the work essentially needs to be done by December 31st for you to fully realize the energy savings and carbon reduction and have it recorded in your 2030 baseline period. Next slide. So if you are focusing on the timeline that from now until 2029, which is where the ball is in your court and action needs to be taken, there is a phased approach that we work with properties on. And the first phase starts with investigation. It is critical for you to understand first and foremost where your energy is being used, what end users are your highest energy consumers, and thus kind of impacting the carbon emissions by in the largest way. Performing an energy audit, typically an energy model driven audit that will give you the list of measures that you would want to consider in implementing becomes a key first step. So if a property has not completed an audit, as I said, now is the time to get engaged on that and really start investigating where you would want to, bring a change in your energy consumption at the property. The planning phase becomes extremely critical because you could have a list of measures, but you would want to consider a very strategic plan wherein you will be able to evaluate the measures in a phased approach. It is important to understand the impact of a particular measure. It is important to understand the interactivity between different measures and how they stack up, how it impacts your existing equipment, and whether there is a necessity for you to make capital improvements. All of that needs to be happening in the planning phase, so your implementation phase becomes that much more strategic and results in optimal savings. And within the implementation phase, it is critical to start early, engage an expert both on the consulting side and working with reputed contractors and identifying any financial support opportunities through incentives and financial planning support. Next. Right. So going a little bit into the audits, your audits essentially should include a whole variety of applicable measures, right? So like starting with low cost, no cost measures, anything that can be implemented that has a quick payback will not only reduce your energy consumption, but show you the results of your quick action. So it becomes important to identify those measures. You would want to consider if there are any measures that are going to extend the equipment useful life. Say your boiler was replaced 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and you're not considering replacing it, hopefully in the next 10, 15 years, right? What measures can extend the useful life of the boiler become important as part of your 2030 strategy. If you are thinking of capital measures, whether it's windows, roof, insulation or ventilation overhaul, it is critical to understand that those will not only improve the system, but also reduce your heating and cooling loads for any future transition. So that is also a very critical component of the audit. And then finally, replacing the equipment needs to come with a holistic approach. And when you are at a point wherein you have to make a decision of investing in a fossil fuel or an electrification technology, it becomes critical for you to understand what measures you would want to implement so that the future system is sized optimally and is also reducing your operation and maintenance costs. Next slide. Right. So as I mentioned, the emphasis is really on the planning phase, and you would want to evaluate what measures will give you the most bang for the buck. So it's no longer just reliant on simple payback or payback period or your net ROI. You would want to understand where investing $100 will result you in as much of carbon reduction as possible, because your fines are going to be based on the carbon emissions that you have post 2030. So evaluating those measures not just by their energy reduction, but also carbon reduction potential and fine reduction potential become extremely critical, right? And the complexities of those measures are further exacerbated by their interactivity and their dependence on implementing in phases. So it becomes very critical to plan your measures in a way that you can stack them and realize the savings as soon as possible, right? So leveraging expert guidance and planning tools becomes extremely critical, which is why we're kind of currently working on a new platform. Next slide. Right. So we are super excited to be working on the Bright Power Predict software, which is essentially an AI-driven software that will help properties come up with this strategic planning, right? Our new platform is coming soon, and it will allow properties to manage their carbon reduction plans with the building performance expertise that Bright Power possesses with an AI optimized forecasting. So a combination of our expertise in helping clients implement several measures, going through the complexity of electrification, plus this AI-backed platform is going to be extremely critical for properties to achieve their 2030 and beyond goals. So because of this process, you're not just investing money in the process, you're also investing time and valuable resources along the way. And properties that are already taking action know how important it is to come up with the strategies that are holistic and can help you achieve your goals. So it is critical to have a partner who can optimize your investments and deliver maximum results. So we are super excited about Predict using that built-in Bright Power engineering expertise so that you can model your scenarios and act with the agility that this process requires. So more to come on that, but we are super excited to be working on this to support our services that are driven to reduce your carbon emissions. Next slide. Right. So the implementation phase, which is where most of the work needs to be done, is again in and itself a fairly complex process. Not only are you required, and this applies to most measures that will require hiring contractors and bring in expert consultants, right? We're not talking about the small tweaks that you can do, the retrocommissioning measures that can be done in-house, but this is majority of the work that needs to be done for you to implement measures to bring down your carbon emissions. A few slides ago, Amanda mentioned all the properties that will require to do some work. So you're thinking of two out of three properties will require some work. So you can imagine not just the complexity of the work that needs to be done, but you're also competing for resources, for technical guidance, for incentives, and it's just an added challenge for properties that are still waiting to take action. Typically, the implementation phase for most measures is broken out into three different stages. The pre-construction stage is wherein you would identify the work that needs to be done. You would select the equipment. You would hopefully select a really good contractor who has experience and expertise working on those measures and who can ensure that maximum savings are realized. Through the construction phase, you are making sure that your energy consultant or partner who is supporting you through this process is ensuring that the installation is happening according to the building requirement and the design requirements. The incentive approval and ensuring that the incentive funding is received in a timely fashion also happens during this construction phase. The post-construction phase is again another critical component wherein you'd be able to evaluate the success of the project, hopefully through functional performance testing, making sure that the installation of the measures or the equipment is happening according to the requirement, and also tweaking and planning your next measures. So the post-construction phase is essentially not just closing out the project, but also planning for your next set of measures. Next slide. Right. So we saw 2 and 3 properties will require some amount of work. 1 and 2, which is 50% of the properties, will require some amount of electrification. And I've said this in a few webinars and external forums, but existing buildings electrification is one of the most challenging things that the properties are facing due to the technology, the complexity that is involved in converting your fossil fuel systems and the investment, right? So there are these factors that make the electrification approach very critical. So few things that we strongly recommend in our communication, in our audits or studies, is identifying, again, the key components that should be considered in this electrification phase, right? So first and foremost, you would want to get as much out as possible in your existing equipment. So if you're implementing measures, if you can extend your existing equipment by 2, 3, 5 years, it gives you that much more time to plan for electrification rather than having to make a decision in the next 1 or 2 years and rushing to get through it, right? Implementing load reducing measures, as I said, becomes extremely critical because you don't want to do a like-for-like sizing on your fossil fuel systems. If you're familiar with a steam or a hydronic boiler, most apartments end up being overheated, or even for the most balanced systems, you're looking at 74 to 75 degree indoor space temperatures. Sizing and electrification equipment to deliver that heat is going to be extremely challenging, expensive, and not so energy efficient. So you would want to consider load reducing measures such as envelope improvements, reducing your domestic hot water load, and ventilation as well, so that you're sizing the equipment for the peak load and the most efficient load at the property. Infrastructure upgrades, right? So most electrification in existing buildings will require some form of infrastructure upgrades. Buildings that were built in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years were built according to the requirements at the time of construction and adhering to the codes applicable at that time. In most cases, you will have to come up with upgrades to your existing electrical infrastructure, not as just in the common areas, but in the apartments as well. So it becomes an important phase and a step towards electrification. And then finally, identifying heating and domestic hot water electrification, laundry, cooking equipment also are part of kind of full electrification, but planning on heating, domestic hot water electrification, whether it's a phased approach, whether you're doing domestic hot water first or heating, just to understand what electrification means for you, is a very critical component of this phase. Next slide. Right. So we could essentially have a full kind of conversation just about electrification, but some of the things that I wanted to leave you with are what I call are the must-dos, right? Unless you're absolutely clear about the technology, you've had an evaluation done about the infrastructure, you know exactly how much investment you need to do, what technology is applicable. Unless you have this, we strongly recommend starting with a feasibility assessment, right? You need to understand all the components of this before, of electrification before you start on that journey. So the feasibility study becomes extremely critical, right? Evaluating the infrastructure upgrades, confirming if you have service availability. Con Ed is continuing to work on making the data more feasible, and there are ways that you can file a load letter and really get a confirmation on whether the service that you're expecting at the property once electrification is done is available or not. So it becomes a critical step to even consider this future electrification. I cannot highlight enough the importance of having an expert consultant and a licensed electrician to make these decisions. You're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in a lot of cases, millions of dollars of investment. You are completely shifting how energy is used. You're completely shifting how your maintenance protocols are. So it is important that you work with consultants and experts as early as possible, so your decisions are taken towards the right step. And covering electrification in a phased approach is in all likeliness like the best approach that you can take, rather than just trying to do everything at once, right? It could be partial electrification, or converting part of maybe your domestic hot water to see how your building kind of performs. And all of those steps that you take will realize energy and carbon reduction opportunities. So a phased approach is what we strongly recommend for properties that are considering electrification. Next slide. Right. So as we were thinking of how to bring all of the points that we discussed together to highlight the importance of what a fine avoidance strategy looks like, and we have these kind of 8 or 9 points, right? In most cases, properties that are facing significant fines will require addressing each and every one of those 9 points. Again, starting with benchmarking, making sure that you have a holistic approach, you have a very strong consultant who can support your investigation, planning, and implementation phase. Properties that will require electrification will also require deep energy retrofits, and nothing's going to happen without proper financial planning and implementation support. So it's just a representation of what we believe are some of the key components for properties to avoid fines or significantly reduce your 2030 fines as soon as possible. Next slide. Right. So Amanda,
Okay.
to bring us home.
Yeah, bringing us home. We're almost done. And so now is the time to get started. Thank you, Pudi, for talking us through those retrofit strategies. And I think the key takeaway from all of this is that, you need to get started now rather than later, even though 2030 sounds far away. It takes several years to plan and implement a good retrofit project, and you're going to be competing with 50,000 other buildings that are subject to similar requirements, are going to be on a similar timeline. And you absolutely want to be at the front of that line. Particularly as we think about trying to get your projects funded, our current utility and NYSERDA incentive programs are nice, but they can't serve anywhere close to the type of volume that we're going to see for this 97 retrofit wave of activity. And so our policy team is working really hard behind the scenes to try to get more subsidy available for these projects. But your best bet is to get that funding to be at the front of the line. And so if your emissions reporting data is bad, even if you do try to start planning for a retrofit now, you will likely still face delays. And so all the pieces that we're talking about today are connected, right? Thinking about the quality of your benchmarking, the quality of your 97 emissions reporting data, all of that is the foundation of your project planning. And then you have to think about, the fine exposure of your properties for 2030, what types of retrofit and electrification strategies you need, having enough time to actually plan that well, and then doing the implementation work to get under your emissions limit. So all of those pieces are connected. If you try to skimp on any one of them, you're putting yourself at higher risk of getting fined. And so what we're really trying to do here at Bright Power is to help you do it right the first time. We understand that owners and managers have dozens of different compliance requirements that you all are navigating at any different time. And so we're here to help set you up with the support and the expertise that you need to make sure that you have a plan for 2050. Because unlike those other requirements, 97 will never be just a quick checkbox. And the sooner that everyone understands that, the better. But when you have the right expert, 97 becomes an opportunity to do, needed upgrades at your building, but also to meet your organizational sustainability goals, to improve your tenant comfort, to increase your property valuations, to reduce your operating costs. There are so many benefits when you start early and invest in your data, and it doesn't have to be an enormous headache. All right. I think that's it for our slides. So now we will move into our Q&A. So please continue to drop your questions in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll pick them up there and we will get started.